Okay, everybody, I'm pleased to be able to speak today with Patrick McKeown, who is the president of the Buteco Professionals International and a member of the management board and advisory faculty of the International Academy of Breathing and Health. He has penned 7 books, including 3 Amazon.com bestsellers, and has been invited to speak at dental and respiratory conferences throughout the world. Patrick is also the creator of Oxygen Advantage and has instructors all around the world to teach proper breathing. I first learned about Patrick when I was teaching for the Czech Institute, and then again when I read the book, Breath, The New Science of a Lost Art by James Nestor, which if you guys haven't read it, for anyone, for me, I've been interested in breathing all my life, it's still a fascinating book to see how James goes through this book and tells his story. And Patrick is one of the world's leading experts on breathing, focusing on the Buteco method, and he's really kind of a missionary on the subject, and he shares his knowledge freely with people. Patrick suffered himself from asthma at a young age, got little relief from different medicines and inhalers he was using, but discovered the Buteco method at the age of 26, and that changed his life. And I will let Patrick tell you about the Buteco method as we talk about breathing and the importance of, for some of us, relearning how to breathe again. So Patrick, again, I know you're a busy man. Thank you so much for joining me here on Zoom, and I really appreciate your time.
Yeah, of course, Dan. It's a pleasure. Thanks very much.
Excellent. So I'm going to start you off with a simple question. On average, how many times a day does the average person breathe?
Well, the average person, if you were breathing, it depends really. You know, we should be breathing probably about 12 to 14 breaths per minute. And if you're to multiply that by 60 minutes per hour and multiply that by 24, but typically, I suppose it can range from about 15,000 breaths up to about 30,000 breaths per day. Yeah. And if you have somebody that's breathing 20 breaths per minute, which is too high, but common, you know, you've got 1,200 breaths there an hour, multiplied by that by 24 is 28,800 breaths. So yeah, the one thing about breathing is that we all breathe differently.
Mm. Right. And so that's the average person. And you just glossed over briefly, but what should we be breathing? How many times a minute should we be breathing?
Ideally, an ideal respiratory rate is between 10 and 14 breaths or 12 and 14 breaths, in around that. Now, that's the way it was 20 years ago, but now we are seeing that in medical literature that the description of the ideal respiratory rate is 16 breaths per minute. It's too fast. So what seems as normal breathing is changing. And I suppose it's not just about looking at the respiratory rate. We also need to consider tidal volume, or the depth of breath, because really, you know, it's looking at the respiratory rate multiplied by tidal volume to give us minute ventilation. How much air are we breathing across 1 minute? And we could go one step further and ask, how much air are we taking into our nose and mouth? And of that, how much air is getting down into the small air sacs for gas exchange to take place? In other words, we can make a lot of changes to breathing, even just to enhance oxygen uptake and delivery.
Right. So, you know, I remember we mentioned Paul Chek. I remember being a student of his, and he would say, hey, textbooks tell you should breathe, you know, 16 to 18 or 20 times a minute. And he would always say, no. Healthy people truly only breathe about 6 to 10 times a minute. That's what he was saying, you know, back when I was a young kid sitting in his class. And I was always fascinated by breathing and how, again, like you said, different people have different methods of breathing and different rates, etc. So is it safe to say then that the majority of the population would hyperventilate?
Hyperventilation, it affects different subsets more than others. You know, the thing about it is that, like, everything that I say, I have to be able to support it. And sure, I would say the vast majority of people hyperventilate, but the literature doesn't show that. And we have to consider that hyperventilation is a subset of a bigger issue called, say, breathing pattern disorders. Now, if we look at a Cochrane study back in 2013, it indicated that hyperventilation in breathing pattern disorders affected 9.5% of the general population. But other papers then are showing that in the asthma population, it's 30%, and in the anxiety population, it's 75%.
Wow.
And then if we look at a paper published by Kiesel, who's a professor of physical therapy from Evansville University, I think it's in Colorado, He looked at 51 subjects just 2 years ago. They were 27 years of age, and only 10% of them had normal breathing. Wow. 90% of them failed at least one dimension, whether it was biochemical or biomechanical or psychophysiological. And of that, 20% of them failed all three. So what the Cochrane Review is saying, it's 10%. Well, Dr. Kiesel's paper is showing it's a minimum of double that. And, you know, depending on how much or what dimension the individuals are failing in terms of breathing, because breathing, people think like sometimes, oh, it's about taking a deep breath or a big breath, or, you know, there's so much misinformation out there. We have to go into breathing a little bit more in detail. Like, one of the things with the Buteyko method, we were focusing, and I was focusing on the biochemistry primarily, but that doesn't necessarily take into consideration the biomechanics. And now what we're doing, especially with Oxygen Advantage, it gave me some freedom to open up to consider breathing from a multidimensional point of view. And because I suppose, Dan, whatever way we are trained, we can't deviate outside that training, because who am I to change the Buteyko method? I'm not the founder of the technique. So when I'm performing, or when I'm doing the technique, I will follow to the best that I can. Yes, I have made some tweaks here and there, and I've made some additions to it. But with Oxygen Advantage, it gave me the freedom to open up. And the more you explore the breath, the potential of this is absolutely amazing. You know, and really where the research is at, even looking at just one dimension, looking at resonant frequency breathing, slowing down the breath to influence the autonomic nervous system, because, you know, we could talk about that even just for the next hour, but there's so many aspects to it.
So I got a couple follow-ups on that. So going back to James Nestor's book, I remember him talking about the perfect breath. With the 5 seconds in and 5 seconds out, roughly, where did that come from? Do you know?
That was the perfect breath. Is something that you practice for different times throughout the day. It's not necessarily to give the explanation to people that that's how they should be breathing all day long. However, when you do have a Bolt score that's 40 seconds plus, the respiratory rate is typically 6 to 8 breaths per minute. Now, the resonant frequency, the research of it seems to stem from a researcher called Paul, if I'm pronouncing his surname correctly, Lehrer, Lehrer. And it was in the 1990s when they were experimenting with heart rate variability. So a healthy person, the timing between their heartbeats should be random and in rhythm. And there's a connection between the timing of our heartbeat and our respiration. That's called respiratory sinus arrhythmia. And typically during the in-breath, our heartbeat should be getting faster. And on the out-breath, the heartbeat should be getting slower. Now, in the studies on resonant frequency breathing, they determined that when you slow down the respiratory rate to between 4.5 and 6.5 breaths per minute, and a good average is 6 breaths, you can't go wrong, a 5 seconds in and a 5 seconds out, that's the optimum breathing rate for achieving a balance in the autonomic nervous system. And heart rate variability, you know, we have to look at the research on this. It's immense. Now, the other thing that I will say is that there are a number of ways of improving heart rate variability, not just slowing down the resonant frequency, not just slowing down the breath to 6 breaths per minute, but nasal breathing during sleep. We have seen it many, many times over, that nose breathing, deeper sleep, improved HRV with people who are monitoring their sleep via Oura rings, etc. Reduced volume breathing to create air hunger. So also when you practice breathe light biochemical, that you are breathing less air to expose the body to a slightly higher elevated carbon dioxide in the blood, that in turn can increase heart rate variability. Now, I would go as far as saying that nasal breathing during physical exercise can impart also an impact on that. Now, during the nasal breathing with light breathing, your HRV will dip, but after the exercise, your HRV will rebound, it comes back up. So that's what the researchers are finding, and it's a measure typically of vagal tone. Like if we consider us as human beings, you know, some of us have, you know, we have a really unfortunate life event, a lot of stress that we may be exposed to. We go to our doctor, we say to the doctor, we say, doctor, I'm feeling really stressed. The doctor is there looking at us, and they typically have no way of clinically measuring the impact of stress on the body.
Right.
But heart rate variability biofeedback, we can measure that stress. And heart rate variability is only a measurement. The key is, how can you influence it? And it's known that individuals who are not well, either emotionally or physically, they typically have reduced heart rate variability.
Right.
So people with PTSD, people with anxiety, people with depression, people with asthma, COPD, irritable bowel syndrome, the list goes on. Hypotension, hypertension. And like, we would love to see that this is common knowledge, and not just to rely on slowing down the respiratory rate to 6 breaths per minute, because the mistake that people could make is that when they slow down their breathing to 5 seconds in and 5 seconds out, the amplitude or tidal volume could increase disproportionately. So it could cause an increase in minute ventilation. And the problem with that is that it sacrifices the biochemistry. So when I'm working with students, and also in a new book that I've just submitted, that we're looking at breathing from 3 dimensions. We start off with the biochemical aspect first, because that in itself is important. Because when you breathe slightly less air to allow carbon dioxide to accumulate in the blood, you're reducing the chemosensitivity of the body to carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is the primary stimulus to breathe. And when you have a reduced chemosensitivity of the body to carbon dioxide, your breathing is naturally slower and also more likely to be diaphragmatic. And that can be indicated by measuring the Bolt score. So a higher Bolt score will typically indicate slower breathing and more diaphragmatic breathing. So we go through the biochemistry dimension because we can influence blood circulation and oxygen delivery. And people typically with slightly faster breathing, slightly harder breathing, they more often than not have cold hands and cold feet. Right. So we have them do that exercise and they start to feel the temperature coming into the hands. And then we move on to the biomechanics, and we have lateral expansion and contraction of the lower ribs to generate intra-abdominal pressure for functional breathing. In other words, allowing the exhalation to go back, that the diaphragm is going back into its full resting position, because it's the movement of the diaphragm during the exhalation back to its resting position, which is going to influence the inhalation and to increase the zone of apposition. And then we look at resonant frequency breathing, and then we tie all 3 together, and then we bring it into physical exercise. And then I also do breath holding, which is designed to drop the blood oxygen saturation and increase carbon dioxide as a stressor. And we need to look at sleep. I want to look at breathing. Like I taped up my mouth 22 years ago. I started taping my mouth, and it was the first night that I'd woke up. Well, the first night after the first night, my morning waking up was still a bit getting used to it. It was the second morning I woke up, and I had the best night's sleep that I ever had in 20 years, ever that I could remember. I remember waking up feeling alert, that if somebody was to hand me a technical paper, I could concentrate on it. Now, despite that, Dan, we know that especially individuals over 40 years of age, are 6 times more likely to spend at least 50% of their sleep time breathing through an open mouth. Now, we have to look at breathing in terms of sleep, because ultimately, if we don't get deep sleep, we are not going to get rest and restoration. And we're going to wake up feeling groggy, and we cannot perform and we cannot recover. So in terms of athletes who want to achieve a recovery, I would say absolutely look at your breathing.
Yeah, I was taught that breathing is the absolute, and every person that walks through my door, the first thing I have to look at is breathing, because it ties into everything about our human being. So I love the medical community, don't get me wrong, but I have a question. So do you think the reason why the numbers are kind of skewed is because the medical community really studies, I live in America, and Americans are not very healthy.
So we're catching up, don't worry.
Yeah. Is it because the medical community more studies the disease model instead of the health model? Is that why, some of the respiratory numbers are skewed, would you say?
I think there's very little interest from medical doctors in breathing. Very little interest. If I was to contact my local Asthma Society of Ireland, and let's face it, we're a population of 5 million people. We've an incidence rate of 10% of the population having asthma, 500,000 people almost. And if I was to talk to them about the importance of nose breathing, they wouldn't be interested. They have never been interested. Most pulmonologists, not interested, except for a few. There's a few ear, nose, and throat doctors. There's a few pulmonologists, but the individuals that are, I suppose it's like this, Dan. If you spend 8 or 10 years training in a particular field and you're in that role, and that's the way most people will just stick, and they'll be tunnel vision completely in that role, and they don't deviate. There's only a certain few people that deviate from that.
Right.
And whether they are innovators or, you know, whatever they are, but we do have some medical doctors who are tremendous. I've trained a number of them. I've trained a few ear, nose, and throat doctors, a few sleep specialists. Like even the research, I submitted yesterday a 10,000 word article for a medical journal, which I can send on to you. And I submitted it for publication, looking for the application of functional breathing for sleep and for sleep apnea. And despite the connections being there for 7 years, nobody has done one piece of research, nobody. And it's crying out for research. And given that, you know, breathing can really offer a lot of help for people with sleep disorder breathing, because the reality is the gold standard of treatment is falling short because compliance is 50%.
Right.
So, you know, you have, for example, whether it's the United States, whether it's Europe, and typically in the Western world, 43% of the male population over 50 years of age, 43%. And for that age group between 30 and 50, between 30 years and 50 years of age, it's 26% of the population. Now, in the females, it's 9% between 30 and 50 years of age. But once the woman goes post-menopause, it triples to 27%.
Wow.
Now, the gold standard of treatment for sleep is a CPAP machine, which was invented by a Dr. Colin O'Sullivan, and he got the idea from a vacuum cleaner. And a vacuum cleaner sucks air. This is the truth. A vacuum cleaner sucks air, and the CPAP machine is the opposite to the vacuum cleaner. It's pumping air at a particular pressure. So you're either wearing a nasal cannula or a full face mask, and it's pumping air down your throat to splint open the airways. Now, how on earth could compliance be high with that? It's not.
It's not.
But despite compliance being poor, there has been still no investigation. And like, I was on a panel with James Nestor, who you spoke about earlier on, and about 10 other professionals. Most of them were orthodontists. There might have been a couple of medical doctors in it. And the same question came up. And the only thing that I could think was, if it promised to make substantial amounts of money,
yes,
breathing would be taught. And that is it. That is the bottom line. The evidence is there. There's no side effects. There's no side effects from teaching somebody to breathe through the nose. And even if we look at the structure of the human nose, so if we look at the anatomy of the mouth here, when we look at the anatomy of the mouth, we'll see, sorry there, my camera's after shifting. Okay. We will see that with the anatomy of the mouth, that the mouth performs absolutely no function in terms of breathing.
Right.
So when air is taken in through the mouth, it goes straight down the throat. And nature has equipped us. So here we take a breath in through the mouth, it goes straight down the throat. Nature has equipped us with a nasal cavity that's sitting right above the roof of the mouth. And this nasal cavity is designed to filter, moisten, regulate volume, harness nasal nitric oxide. Your nose is connected with the diaphragm breathing muscle. Our diaphragm breathing muscle is connected with the upper airway dilator muscles. It's one airway, you know, and even, I suppose, now we should be considering COVID. Yeah. Who is telling who to breathe through the nose? Nobody. I put a video out in March on YouTube, and it went viral, and it was a terrible video. The lighting is bad, the sound is bad, everything is bad, but it went viral. And now we're starting to see that there was an article published.
I was going to say, yeah, the Journal of Aerosol Science. Yeah.
And about the importance of nasal breathing. Could nasal nitric oxide mitigate COVID-19? And again, this is common sense.
Right.
Because the first line of defense in the human body in terms of breathing is the nose. The mouth offers absolutely none. And people will say, well, you know, your immune system is there to protect you. Well, let's enhance what we can do. And the other thing is, like, I'm flying to Denmark tomorrow. I don't want to fly. I'm committed to it, and I don't want to pull out at this stage. But I'm going to do a few things. Number one is I am going to wear a mask. And despite the politics and everything else that's out there, I'm still going to wear a mask because I want to enhance my ability to protect, reducing viral load. And wearing a mask and nose breathing, but also breathing light. If I'm in the company of somebody who's close by, and if they're coughing and if they're all over the place, I don't want to be inhaling anything that's coming out of their nose or mouth. Absolutely. So I want to breathe less air. And mouth breathers, unfortunately, emit 42% greater water loss. And when we're talking about a virus that's carried via particles, water particles, breathing out through the mouth, it's like an aerosol going out into the atmosphere. Sure. So you can imagine somebody that's at home, they're in their family home. Unfortunately, they may be infected with COVID. They're there, they're caught for breath, they're breathing faster, they're breathing upper chest, they're suffocated. And nobody is telling these people, breathe through your nose, put your hands either side of your lower ribs, slow down your breathing, increase your alveolar ventilation, and this will increase oxygen uptake in the blood. And you can monitor this via pulse oximetry. Very simple thing to do. But what are we doing? Wash your hands and wear a mask. You know, again, breathing has been forgotten about here.
And I don't know if you saw the new unveil of the Series 6 Apple Watch yesterday, but they have now built in, they can do your pulse ox through the watch, which is, you know, mind-blowing to me.
It's mind-blowing. It's mind-blowing. It's simple enough technology. There's a little red light and an infrared light in it. And it's able to pick up by virtue of the light that's passing through.
Right.
So hemoglobin when it's occupied by oxygen, so they can pick up on it. But yeah, that's where it's going. Like we've been using pulse oximetry for many years, and we typically use it. Like it's very accessible. And I use it with athletes to stress them, pretty much, to disturb the blood acid base balance, to force them into, you know, intermittent hypoxic hypercapnia, because I suppose athletes will do high intensity interval training to stimulate anaerobic glycolysis. And if you do high intensity interval training, your blood oxygen saturation will drop marginally, maybe down to 93% or 91%, but we can drop it down into the 80s. We can drop it into the 70s. We don't want to drop it into the 60s because I don't want people passing out.
Right.
And it typically doesn't happen anyway because we don't hyperventilate before the breath hold.
Right. So we talked about the physiology part, and we know that breathing changes your biochemistry from top to bottom. Let's talk mechanically for a second. So I was taught that the first 2/3 of the breath, and you mentioned the word diaphragm. I could spend an entire day talking with you about the diaphragm. To me, it's the most important muscle in the human body. The heart's an organ for me. You know, the most important artery, the most important vein, the vagus nerve runs through it, the psoas runs through it, the esophagus runs through it. I mean, you can go on and on. So I was taught that the first 2/3 of the breath should come from the diaphragm, and then the remaining third from the chest cavity. And when you think about the chest cavity, I always tell my clients, think of it like an umbrella. You open the umbrella and it opens in 360 degrees. It's not just the front that's moving, it's like an umbrella. So biomechanically, what is your perspective on how a proper breath should occur?
It's the same.
It's
the same. Yeah, it's in and out through the nose. Number one, I will always say to people, you cannot engage the diaphragm adequately if you are a mouth breather.
Right.
So, you know, you can think of many disciplines and they are teaching diaphragmatic breathing, but they're not actually teaching nasal breathing. And I'll always say to my students, I need your lips together and I need your tongue resting in the roof of the mouth, breathing in and out through the nose. And I say to them, if you look down at your chest and take a breath through the mouth, when you breathe through your mouth, what part of the body is moving? And typically there's a greater amplitude of the upper chest.
Yeah.
And that's fight or flight. Mouth breathing is faster as well. So fast breathing, slightly faster breathing and upper chest breathing is typically more a stress response. It's activating a sympathetic response. And you're breathing in fast, but you're breathing out fast. And it's the exhalation that typically has more of an impact or more of an influence on the autonomic nervous system in terms of activating a sympathetic, which is a stress response, or a parasympathetic, which is a rest response.
So it's more the exhalation that's going to trigger whether it's a sympathetic or a parasympathetic response.
Yeah. So if you breathe in fast and if you breathe out really slow, you will still activate the parasympathetic response. But if you breathe in fast and if you breathe out fast, you'll activate the stress response. So nose breathing then, and it's not, I suppose, like in my earlier days, I would say people put one hand just above your navel. And as you breathe in, your tummy is gently moving out. And as you breathe out, your tummy is gently moving in. But now we put a much more emphasis on the lateral expansion and contraction of the lower ribs, because we can gauge the generation of intra-abdominal pressure there. And I would agree, 75% of the movement should be driven by the diaphragm, and 25% or 20% upper chest. And that's during rest. So, and the other thing is during sleep, Dan, because we have 20 muscles in our throat.
Yep.
And a subset of those muscles are designed to help maintain an open airway. But those muscles are connected literally with the diaphragm breathing muscle. So when we breathe with greater amplitude of the diaphragm, it increases lung volume and it causes a stiffening of the throat. Now it's coming back to this. How many people wake up with a dry mouth in the morning? They're fast breathing, hyperventilating, upper chest breathing all night long. They're not harnessing the amplitude of the diaphragm. And as a result, that's going to contribute to greater collapse of the throat during sleep. It's just amazing. And one doctor was Dr. Christian Guilleminault, and he spoke. And I remember I was at a conference in Bordeaux in France, or I spoke at a few conferences, and he spoke at the same conferences. So I've heard him speak a number of times. Now, sadly, he passed on, but he coined the phrase obstructive sleep apnea back in the 1970s, and he also developed the apnea-hypopnea index, which is a measurement of sleep apnea severity.
Yeah.
I remember him standing up amongst his peers and he's saying, doctors, you are talking about everything except one thing. You are missing the real crux of this. And I'm paraphrasing him here, but he spoke, it's the importance of nasal breathing. And in his papers, you will see him use the words, the critical importance of restoring nasal breathing, both during wakefulness and sleep, as being the only valid and complete correction. Now, this was with pediatric sleep disorder breathing. And the same applies for adults. But yet, who was looking at our children, whether they are breathing through their nose or mouth? Who was looking at your golfers, whether they are breathing through their nose or mouth? And I know we have our own golfer, Rory McIlroy, and I've no connection to him, unfortunately. But every time I see him, he's going around with his mouth open. And, it's going to affect flow state. It's going to affect, because if we are breathing through the mouth, we are typically breathing using the upper chest, and we are not getting the benefits in terms of amplitude of the diaphragm providing stabilization of the spine. So functional breathing and functional movement go together. And in one paper by Bradley, going back to 2014, 87.5% of people who passed the functional movement screen, and I know the screen has its critics, right, but I would say use any screen which is looking at functional movement. But in this particular study, 87.5% of them who passed the screen were diaphragmatic breathers. Now, if breathing is not normalized, movement is not normalized. And if movement is not normalized, we are setting ourselves up for a greater risk of injury. And it's time that athletes start breathing in and out through the nose. And I'm talking about during rest. I'm talking about during sleep, because it's your everyday breathing which is going to determine your breathing during physical exercise.
So let's talk about that beautiful thing called the nose. I don't think people really, it's so important, the olfactory. Yes. An infant smells its mother. It doesn't see its mother. Yes. I've done some of the dining in the dark things where you go to a restaurant, it's pitch black. You have no idea what they're going to put in front of you. And all of a sudden this amazing smell and the taste, of the food is magnified by 10. But, isn't it true that basically, now, have you heard of the rule of thirds? I was taught this by Paul Chek. So he says, I don't know where this came from. And I asked James Nestor about this too. And he said, if you take your index finger and you go like that and make like a 6-shooter, and if you put your thumb underneath your chin, it should touch the bottom of your nose. And if you put your thumb underneath your nose, it should touch between your eyebrows.
I came across it.
Yeah, and if you put your thumb at your eyebrows, it should touch your hairline. And you'll notice with children these days that the middle third is really short, kind of like a pug or a bulldog, almost like they're losing that thing. So isn't it true that middle third is roughly the size of your fist. That's how much nasal cavity we have there.
Yeah, I think the ratio that you refer to, I think it's called the golden ratio. If you were to Google it, and I remember looking at photographs of it, that beautiful looking faces are in absolute proportion. And here is the thing, mouth breathing is not creating beautiful looking faces.
No.
And I'm saying that as a mouth breather for so many years, because if we have the mouth open, we cannot have our tongue resting in the roof of the mouth. And it's the pressure exerted by the tongue as it rests in the roof of the mouth that's helping to develop the top jaw, the maxilla. It's not only flattening it and widening the top jaw, but it's directing the growth of the face forward. And this is very important because when the face grows forward, it opens up the airway. So if we consider this airway here as the size of our thumb, now you see my maxilla is set back. My lower jaw is even set back again. I would never be an athlete. I could never be an athlete because I'd have a compromised airway. And 25 to 50% of studied children are persistently mouth breathing. Now, coming back to your question, the best way that I kind of explain it to the students coming in is, I say, put your tongue into the roof of your mouth like this and drag your tongue all the way along the roof of the mouth until you feel the soft palate. The roof of your mouth is the floor of your nose. So if you were to look in a mirror and look into your palate, well, sitting above your mouth is your nasal cavity. It's not just this thing that you look at when you're seeing your face in the mirror. This is only about 25%. And again, coming back to our model, you see here, this the nasal cavity here. And when I turn it around, now we are seeing the depth of the nasal cavity and what it can do in terms of breathing. And you have turbinates here, which are designed to, you know, to regulate volume, to swirl the air, to moisten it. First line of defense. Nitric oxide that's emanating from the nasal cavity and the paranasal sinuses. With each breath that we take, we carry that nitric oxide into our lungs. Nitric oxide is a signaling molecule for the upper airway dilator muscles during sleep. The precise role not fully understood during sleep. Nitric oxide then is redistributing the blood throughout the lungs. Because typically as human beings, because of gravity, whether we are standing or sitting as we are now, that the lower lobes have the greatest concentration of blood. But if we are breathing through the mouth, it's the upper lobes that we are ventilating more. And this is reducing then, this is reducing gas exchange. And it's been known since 1988 that when individuals post-jaw surgery, when they were forced to breathe continuously through their nose, that the pressure of oxygen, the PaO2, increased by 10% with nasal breathing versus mouth breathing. But Dan, think of it in terms of focus and concentration and mental health. I work a lot with people with anxiety, and I work with them with panic attacks, and I work with them with agoraphobia, and very often I'm seeing dysfunctional breathing patterns. I'm seeing faster breathing, I'm seeing upper chest breathing, and it's not just that anxiety is causing us to breathe faster in upper chest, but faster in upper chest breathing is feeding into anxiety. Now, can you think of the amount of people suffering from anxiety? They're doing cognitive training, which is great. It's all good, but it doesn't change respiratory physiology. We also have to change breathing patterns. We have to change our breathing from both a biochemical, a biomechanical, and coming back to the diaphragm, our diaphragm breathing muscle is not just for respiration, but it is connected with the emotions as well. That, you know, that we're not, if we breathe light, slow and deep, there's signaling, there's messaging coming, and it may be coming via the vagus nerve from the body back to the brain. And this communication from the body back to the brain is realizing, well, the body at this time is breathing slowly, so the person mustn't be stressed. And from that feedback, then the brain will naturally calm down. And that's since March of 2017, Stanford's medical school identified a new structure, neurons in the brain. And they said that these neurons are spying on your breathing. So you can imagine you've got neurons in your brain which are spying on your breathing. And if you breathe fast, these neurons are communicating to another structure called the locus coeruleus. And the locus coeruleus then, when you breathe fast, this then is causing agitation to the rest of the brain, but it's also likely to waken you up from sleep. So individuals with insomnia, if they are breathing fast, they are more likely to have what's called low arousal threshold. So they're waking up with cognitive difficulty, they're tired, they have poor concentration. So the speed of our breathing is not just affecting our mental health, but it's also affecting our sleep. But it's like the people coming into me with depression. And of course, I'm doing everything online at the moment, but people coming into me with depression, and I say to them, listen, I say, how do you feel when you wake up in the morning? And they would more often than not, they will tell you that they wake up feeling absolutely exhausted. And I say, has your doctor ever asked you to do a sleep study? And they say no, because maybe the healthcare professional is assuming the person is exhausted because of their depression. It's the depression which is causing their exhaustion. But maybe we have to ask this question. Is it their sleep disorder breathing, including insomnia and obstructive sleep apnea? And we know when the two go together that it's a significant contributor to depression. So maybe if it's the sleep problems that's causing depression, not the other way around. So for somebody with mental health issues, with poor concentration, with poor focus, two things that you need to look at. One is breathing and the other is sleep. And in terms of breathing, it's not about taking that deep, big breath, because that's the greatest load of nonsense that was ever introduced in terms of breathing exercises.
Oh my God, my mind just has gone so many different directions. But so this is kind of a stupid question, but should we ever really breathe through the mouth? I mean, and I know when we exercise, sometimes you have to, but I mean, in theory, we should breathe in and out through the nose, correct? As much as we can.
The nose is the only organ made for breathing. The mouth serves no function whatsoever. The mouth performs no function. There is no benefit by breathing through the mouth. All of the benefits are breathing through the nose. Wow. I think if we were designed to be mouth breathers, our mouth would perform at least some functions or minimum functions. And our ancestors, even during physical exercise, they were innate nasal breathers. And we also know by the shape of skulls, and we know by research with Neanderthals that was, if you put in Neanderthals, and if you look at the research that came out about 2 years ago, they found that Neanderthals had these really wide nostrils. And that wasn't just for handling air during rest, but also during physical exercise.
Sure.
But I'd say, Dan, is like the research is starting to come out a little bit. And there's a professor of sports medicine, and I'm not sure what university he's in. I might have mixed him up with Kiesel earlier on, but his name is George Dallam, D-A-L-L-A-M.
Okay.
And he's been doing research on nasal breathing during physical exercise. And in one paper, he looked at 10 recreational athletes and he had them breathe through their nose exclusively for 6 months. Because there's no point in just grabbing a bunch of athletes and saying, okay, guys, now we're going to have you breathe through your nose and we're going to test you and see how you do. They're going to do crap because they have been probably mouth breathing during physical exercise for the last 20 years. So what Dallam said was, let's get a group of individuals, and he spent 2 years trying to recruit individuals for the study. And after a 2-year recruitment, only 10 people signed up. So that shows you the willingness of people to breathe through their nose for 6 months during all physical exercise. So in any event, he got the guys and gals breathing through their nose during all of their exercise for 6 months, and then he measured them. They were able to achieve 100% of their work rate and intensity, whether they were nasal breathing or whether they were mouth breathing. The fraction of expired oxygen was less with nasal breathing. In other words, the body utilized oxygen better. Ventilation was 22% less with nasal breathing. Now there's an economical saving.
Sure.
There's an economical saving there because we have to consider that with every breath that we take, that there's energy expended by the body. And the harder and faster we breathe, the greater consumption of VO2 in terms of supporting the breathing muscles. Now, the respiratory rate with nasal breathing was 39 breaths per minute. With mouth breathing, it was 49 breaths per minute. And carbon dioxide in the blood, with nasal breathing, it was 40 millimeters of mercury. And with mouth breathing, it was 44 millimeters of mercury. So I would say to any of your listeners, do all of your physical exercises breathing in and out through the nose. Initially, the air hunger is more difficult. However, slow down and keep nasal breathing And what happens is that your body will adapt to it. And typically within 6 to 8 weeks, the air hunger diminishes.
Sure.
Now the benefits, there's
I've been
no
doing this
comparison.
myself when I cycle and stuff. Yeah. It's
No
tough at first.
comparison.
It's tough at first, but it's amazing.
Yeah. People talk about the recovery being better, less exercise-induced bronchoconstriction.
Yep.
Cyclists are very prone to cyclist cough. They're prone to inflammation of the airways. That reduces significantly with nasal breathing. Your nose is improving oxygen uptake, oxygen delivery. It's just, there's absolutely no, and even flow state. And flow state isn't new because that was done by a Dr. John Dolliard back in the 1990s when he got a group of athletes. He had them breathe through their nose during physical exercise, and they were able to enter flow states. So they were alert and relaxed at the same time.
Excellent. So let's talk a little bit about what you've been doing. So tell us what is Oxygen Advantage?
So yeah, like I was working with Buteco, and I still work with Buteco, but now 50% of my work has gone in towards Oxygen Advantage. I remember giving mindfulness and Buteco courses back in 2010. And I wanted to bring together focusing on the mind. In other words, to bring a stillness and bring gaps between thoughts, because many people have a racing mind, and
Monkey
especially
mind, yeah.
it can be genetically and, you know, life situations, and our mobile phone as well is not helping in this instance.
No.
So the mind is being trained to be distracted. And as a result, back, you know, because of the economic crash, I was offering these courses, and it was bringing together breathing, sleep, and mindfulness, bringing all three, because I don't believe that mindfulness is ideal in some ways. It's brilliant. Mindfulness is brilliant, but I think we need to improve functional breathing patterns, and we need to improve our sleep. And that's not addressed in mindfulness. So I brought three together. 95% of the individuals who turned up were females. I was saying, where are all the males? So that was one reason. That was part of the drive. I was saying, we need to have a breathing technique which is all about resilience, performance, recovery, pushing individuals. And that's what the Oxygen Advantage was born by. So, you know, we can look at functional breathing. There's kind of two pillars to it. Functional breathing, that's your everyday breathing, looking at it from biochemical, biomechanical, and also resonant frequency breathing. And then the second pillar is doing extreme breath holding to stress the body. And then we do breathing exercises during physical exercise, and then we look at sleep and everything. So I suppose the Oxygen Advantage is more performance-based. And it's amazing because about 60 to 70% of the individuals who attend, they're 20 to 40 years of age, and they're typically 60 to 70% are male. And we have about 30 to 40% female. Whereas with my Buteco, which I've done for almost 20 years, typically unhealthy people, you know, people coming in with asthma, people coming in with depression, sleep apnea, etc. So that's why I had the two tiers. And Buteco is people coming in with health problems, and Oxygen Advantage is people who are healthy, but coming in looking for performance.
And how many, two questions, how many practitioners would you say you have around the world? And number one, and number two, can you give because a lot of people might not know what Buteco is. Can you give a brief little description of what that is?
Yeah, Buteco was all about the biochemistry. Dr. Buteco, he noticed one thing. He noticed that sick patients, when his patients were becoming sicker, they typically breathed faster and they breathed harder. And they often breathed mouth breathing and upper chest breathing. And so he was noticing that when people got sick, they had a deterioration in their breathing pattern. And he asked the question, was it their sickness which was causing the deterioration in their breathing pattern? Or was it the deterioration in their breathing pattern which was feeding back into the sickness? Now, he based his research on the available research at the time, which is carbon dioxide. His technique is wonderful. It's a wonderful technique, and it's focused mainly on biochemistry. Now, doctors will not agree with the carbon dioxide theory, and that's fine. But look at what he talks about. He talks about the importance of nose breathing versus the mouth. I don't think we need evidence there. I think that's just self-explanatory. That's kind of logical. That's common sense. We don't need double-blinded randomized control trials for the human nose, because evolution has provided us with a nose, equipped us with an organ specifically designed for breathing. And all you have to do is open up a medical textbook and see what does the nose do, and then look at the functions of the mouth.
All right.
So and you know, research, science has moved on. Like nitric oxide from the nose was discovered back in 1991. And you can apply that to Buteyko's work. And then heart rate variability and resonant frequency breathing since the 1990s. You can also apply that to Buteyko's work. So the Buteyko method it's a wonderful method in terms of improving everyday breathing patterns. And certainly he got many things right in terms of the exercises. And yes, the science, you know, doctors, if you look at it, it's very mixed. People giving out about the Buteyko method because the carbon dioxide theory doesn't hold true. Listen, forget about the carbon dioxide theory. Forget about it. Because do we really know what's going on? No. The human body is so complex.
Yes.
And people will debate. And this, Dan, I'm just going to make a point here with children. It's been known since 1909 that children who mouth breathe suffer from sleep disorder breathing, craniofacial changes, poor concentration. They've changes to their face that they don't look as attractive as they should do. But it's not just about the attractiveness. Because of a compromised airway, they're not going to cope with life. Now that's been discussed since 1909, and the orthodontic profession has debated it for 111 years. Now, there's a point that we have to say, what's going on in academia and where can we bring in some common sense here?
Yeah.
And that's why I loved about James Nestor's book. And when I wrote my own book back, like, you know, this stuff we knew, you know, this is not to discredit James's book or anything like that, but really what he has done is he has done a great job to bring it to the forefront, because he is coming to it from being unbiased. And maybe of course I'm going to have my biases, like I teach in this field, but I have seen the results, and I have seen results with about 8,000 individuals, direct, face-to-face. I've seen 8,000 individuals over 18 to 20 years. I've seen results. And despite that, we are lacking research because nobody bothers. Breathing just isn't sexy. You know, if you're a medical doctor, maybe you want to be doing research on stem cells. You want to be doing research on the most innovative and attractive and appealing. You know, there's something about breathing. Breathing is breathing, but maybe it's time to get back to basics in this one.
I think so. I know we have just a few minutes left. And so where can people go to find somebody that you've trained with Oxygen Advantage?
Yeah, we've about, sorry, I never asked your second question, but we've about 200 instructors with Oxygen Advantage. And I don't know how many we have with Buteyko. I think we may have about 300 or 400 instructors with Buteyko. But you will see all of our instructors if you go to either website. One is called buteykoclinic.com and the other is called oxygenadvantage.com. And yeah, our 200 instructors with Oxygen Advantage are across about 40 different countries. And we have some amazing individuals. Like we've got SWAT personnel, special weapons and tactics. We've some of elite forces. We've got Olympians, a number of different Olympians. We've got people from all walks of life, from yoga, from Pilates, from physiotherapy, from strength and conditioning coaches. So there's an amazing group of individuals out there that are teaching these techniques.
Is that website oxygenadvantage.com?
It is, yeah. And the other thing is, like, we have a channel, Oxygen Advantage, on Instagram. And even though I have to say that I'm not a great fan of social media, given its mental health issues, but sometimes we just have to use these things, you know.
And I'm gonna leave with this thing, and I know you're open to this, but again, like you said, everything you say needs to be research based. And as someone who's done a thesis, and you know, the human body to me is very difficult to research because we're an emotional, mental, physical, spiritual being. And I'll never forget, I was brought to Barbados on 2 different occasions to basically see, I think in a 6-day period, I probably assessed 50 people. I mean, I was just one after another. And of course, the first thing I'd always look at was breathing. And I swear, probably out of the 50 people, 1 or 2 actually had what I thought at the time was proper breathing mechanics. And I thought, well, maybe I'm looking at something wrong. What is going on here? And so I get home, I get back to the States, and I call Paul Check, and I said, Paul, I go, am I missing something? And I explained the whole thing to him, and he goes, Dan, that's easy to explain. And I go, because Paul now deals in the metaphysical. I mean, he's gone from the physical to the metaphysical, right? And he said, you know, you put an infant is born, you look at their belly moves up and down, up and down, up and down. You know, they don't have any ideas on how to breathe. And he said, as you're developing as a child, any activity that could cause angst, like you get lost in a grocery store, you see your parents having a fight, you injure yourself, whatever, and you create this holding pattern. And then all of a sudden, you start breathing more through the upper respiratory. And again, I can't prove this, but it just made total sense to me. I mean, we know we can have nasal obstructions. We know we can have a small middle third. There's a lot of physical issues around poor breathing. But I also think, like you said, because you deal with people with emotional, with stress issues, with, you know, things like that, I think there's a really, really big emotional, mental, spiritual component to breathing.
Yeah, I would totally agree with you. We don't know the impact of trauma on individuals, but again, there's a little bit of common sense here. If you look at individuals who during their childhood had very difficult childhood situations, that's carried through into their adulthood. Yes. And we don't see, it's very difficult to see absolutely perfect. And of course, we'll never be human beings. We'll always have imperfections. But people who did have a difficult childhood, they also have a difficult adulthood. That whatever is happening, it's being carried through. And maybe this is where there is an option for bringing in resonant frequency breathing. This is where the research seems to be coming in, you know, in terms of slowing down the respiratory rate, nose breathing, light breathing, slow breathing, deep breathing, and practicing it to a cadence of 6 breaths per minute. And I just point another thing. There's a researcher called Bernardi. He looked at the rosary, which is a prayer that's used in the Catholic religion. Mm-hmm. And he also looked at mantras from yoga. And apparently the rosary originally came from Tibet. So we see a crossover between spirituality. But when the researchers looked at the cadence of the breath, when people were saying the rosary or saying the mantra from Tibet or other mantras, the resonant frequency was 6 breaths per minute. Now, there's something in terms of the breath and spirituality that's absolutely interlinked. This is not new information. This is not new information. Right. And I think one way for anybody who has experienced trauma, and let's face it, life can be very difficult. Many people experience trauma, but one way of helping bodily systems to recover which have been disturbed by stress, tap into your breath.
Wow. And I think we're going to leave it with that. I think that's a great way to end this. And I could talk to you forever. I know you got to get going. I hope you have a very safe trip. Take care of yourself. And again, Patrick, I appreciate your time.
Thanks so much, Dan. Great to talk to you.
I'm going to push stop here. Just hang on 1 second.